Invasion Audiobook, Part 30. Earlier, towards the end of day number 3 of the invasion itself, Bill Glass had by then lay slain upon the mountain summit. This, by having been lit up by the dismounted truck infantry forces, having scaled the mountain gradually to mop up a pocket of armed American mountain people. These armed civilians, now mopped up, were they who had tried to resist the paramilitary forces of the National Militia Fourth Corps of China. This pocket had earlier been split in two by other truck infantry subunits driving their vehicles on a mountain road in a high valley. This road laying down in between the higher positions of where the mountain people then were resisting them at that time. Those Chi-Com forces, moving gradually upward on foot, had eventually reached the summit, thereby fighting atop its peak for supremacy thereon, and thus had eliminated the remaining armed resistance upon that peak, including Bill, among many others. He himself having been KIA'd by multiple gunshot wounds, including one such rifle round having hit him directly in the head, thereby blasting out gore and blood. As he lay there dead, the CCP party flag and the national flag of China were then raised, and therefore lit up by portable floodlighting to symbolize the victory of the Chinese forces there upon the summit. Also, by late on day number 3, the forces miles to the east within Montana, away from the state line fighting then wrapping up, were starting to be hit by airstrikes coming in then by 2 squadrons of ground attack aircraft. One of Russian VVS Su-34s and one consisting of Chinese PLAAF JH-7s, which pounded the higher elevations wherein sat the newer positions of Joseph, Troy, and the National Guard Major's grouping of mixed amalgamated American fighting forces. This had occurred literally just as the Americans in this specific area had completed the digging in of their new homes, all as part of Operation Woodsman, this being an operation planned by Lieutenant General Wu Fong over the whole 4th Militia Corps element of the Chinese paramilitary, who himself had coordinated with both the PLA 7th Group Army sitting further to the east of his forces that would contribute the single company of Z-10 attack helicopters to support the men on the ground. Not to mention as well the 2 squadrons of ground attack jets, each one of the 2 sent from the PLAAF and VVS respectively. The great majority of Lieutenant General Wu Fong's forces under his command were further to the west, having had been a key force fighting in the state line area alongside the PAP's 27th Light Armored Brigade and Russian 205th Cossack Motor Rifle Brigade, itself being a subordinate unit of the larger Russian 49th Combined Arms Army. Also, on the Idaho side of the state line, assisting the Russians, albeit from further south, came 2 subordinate battalions of the PAP's 21st Light Armored Brigade, operating out of Boise, although itself sending half of its elements further to the east and north. respectively. This move of the 21st Light Armored Brigade of the PAP was done to secure the rest of the large, albeit sparsely populated, Idaho state. By the turn of day number 4 from day 3, the assault had begun with massive HE munitions and napalm tanks dropped from the ground attack aircraft upon the American positions higher up in the mountains. It was an abrupt, rude awakening during the night, literally and figuratively speaking, as many of the exhausted Americans who'd been prepping their new positions from many hours of digging were hit close to day 3's end. And now, as day 4 officially had began shortly beyond that point, the ground forces of the 4th Corps, in the form of 2 of their many subordinate truck infantry battalions, advanced in force up the slopes, now approaching the Americans. They came largely on foot, but many of them additionally came upon VP all-terrain vehicles, these being tracked all-terrain vehicles with machine gun mounts upon the roll bars atop the vehicles. They also had mounted upon some of these mortars or Chinese KPVT machine gun copies or grenade launchers. The PLA's contribution to this battle had also begun to make their debut in this instance of combat, as they had traversed through local mountain valleys as they moved west from their new forward operating bases laying east of the current partisan positions. Now they moved in, essentially accompanying the paramilitary infantry moving on the ground as these helicopters buzzed overhead. This, as they now swung around the mountain sides, hovering above the foothills whereupon the 2 battalions moved upwards. These troops now advancing in large formations of all-terrain vehicles accompanied by mostly foot-based troops in column formations, with the companies up front moving in wedge formations. The Americans had been pounded quite substantially by the 2 squadrons of air support delivered by the PLAAF and VVS from their respective 1 squadron apiece, thereby contributed to the battle. The huge quantities of munitions and napalm dropped had thus lit the forests further up ablaze and had killed many people already by this point, as munitions impacted and napalm blazed away. Americans who'd not been underground at the time, or whose underground positions were directly hit by the ordnance, were KIA'd immediately, with others badly wounded or burned on the outskirts of the blast. Of the roughly 600 fighting men and their families, who altogether had comprised some nearly 1,300 total people among the partisans, they had lost some 380 people right away from the initial airstrikes alone. This caused panic amongst the partisan-like forces, who then sent the surviving family members higher up the mountainside and out of the area, to thereby be accompanied by 50 of the fighting men out of some nearly 430 remaining of the original 600 fighting men. This, as the casualties were distributed between both combatants and non-combatants. The rest of the American combatants opted to prepare for a major fight, with the leadership, including Joseph, being largely unwilling to abandon their very recently and well-prepared and highly elevated upon the mountain, dug-in fighting positions. The 430 now remaining fighting men of the Americans now took themselves up into the trench systems, many foxholes, and ad hoc earthen bunkers facing the enemy assault. Now that their non-combatant family members and the infirm were being evacuated, it made using the recently created positions just that much more simplified, as now nobody would be in the way of the fighting, beginning to now unfold in earnest. Small arms and heavy machine gun fire now began to occur as the Chi-Com paramilitary troops rapidly approached up the slope of the mountain, inbound towards the new American positions. In addition to such, also occurring now was the fire of mortars, which themselves were intermixed with the rocket pods, chain guns, and anti-tank missile fire from hovering Z-10 attack helicopters of the PLA, now covering the advance of the paramilitary ground troops from overhead. Move! You! Run and go check on the guys higher up in the third tier of the trenches! Tell them we need intensive interlocking fields of fire in order to support the guys in the bottom two tiers of defenses! Hurry, they're coming! Yelled Joseph to one of his own men from his original forces, of which were now amalgamated with the Frmr Guardsmen, and also Troy's men who were from outside of Bozman originally. The men instructed to do so ran from the inside of the earthen bunker on the first tier of defenses that now encased Joseph. He was now running up a zigzag trench to get to the trench systems on the third tier out of the three parallel trenches. There were several trenches that also ran upwards, which intersected with the second and third trench systems, respectively. This offering a more safe way of travel in between them, generally speaking, insofar as amid a combat situation was concerned. The Americans now were responding with the strongest weapons that they currently possessed. Former heavier weapons brought in by the retreating guardsmen, intermixed with captured Chinese arms from the PAP having been captured and taken by Troy's men, also along with those procured from Joseph's men, in addition to the rest. These ranged in power and effectiveness, from general purpose and heavy machine guns to shoulder-fired RPG-style rockets, and also recoilless shells from the AT-4s or even more potent anti-tank missile systems, like the HJ systems of the Chinese. Furthermore, there included even some mortars of two types, but weren't able to be utilized in a concentrated form due to the small numbers of which currently were in the possession of the Americans. However, the large concentration of dug-in fighting men, all fairly spaced out safely among their positions, put up one hell of a fight by this point. By the time the advanced forces had arrived just into visual range, at roughly a kilometer or slightly more downhill, both sides had opened up violently upon one another. Even so, the National Militia paramilitary troops continued their advance up the slope. All as the initial airstrikes carried out by the ground attack jets had managed to thin out the Americans decently so, among also lighting large segments of the forest ablaze with the napalm somewhat close to the main positions, which in and of itself had prevented a possible wider escape route for the Partisans from the dug-in area upon the slope, due to this being a form of terrain denial. Now, however, there was still a way out known to the Americans, taking them around the large mountain to the other side of it. All in all, this mountain itself was a gigantic protrusion of earth, rock, and forest sticking high up many thousands of feet above sea level. Essentially, if one were looking down upon it, a man compared to the mountain would appear as minuscule as an ant. Just one side of the mountain was itself a massive landmass in terms of the square miles comprising the slope itself. Therefore, while one side was being battered heavily, there was another side more or less untouched. This particular escape route had taken the fleeing non-combatants and their 50 designated armed escorts safely out of the battle space before the napalm fires had spread further. Knowing all the escape routes was a prerequisite within the group's planning before even establishing their new home within the immediate area, as awareness of multiple such escape routes was certainly a necessity for the Partisans. Currently, though, as the fighting intensified while the Chi-Coms moved further up the mountain while simultaneously under heavy partisan fire, the battle still would end up lasting for quite a long time, in the sense of many hours. This was due in large part to the rough terrain and areas of steep slopes and even cliffs in some areas, all coupled together with the fact that the Americans were actually dug in amazingly well, all things considered. Using drones to scout ahead, from small military-grade quadcopter drones at the unit level to larger drones of the PLAAF flying high above to monitor the battlefield, real-time intel was constantly updated to the Chi-Com commanders on the ground, who in turn used such information to tactically direct their forces. Although the PLA and other regular military branches, along with the PAP paramilitary, all having robotic combatant forces at their disposal, these weren't committed to this particular battle, and likewise were busy elsewhere subduing and patrolling other areas across the conquered land. Even so, the drones present alone added plenty to the capabilities of these assaulting paramilitary ground troops. The attacking Chi-Coms, along with their attack helicopter and air support, however, still made things extremely deadly for the defenders, and thereby allowed the ground troops to maximize their overall effectiveness considering the difficulties of such a mission. As of the current moment, within the first hour of Day 4, at the time of the opening of the ground fighting, the Chi-Com forces were about 1 full kilometer downhill from the Americans at the time. Although they were spotted by some of the Americans wielding night vision or infrared optics due to their higher vantage points higher up on the slope. Likewise, the Chinese knew where the Americans were from their own such equipment, alongside of drones, spy planes, and satellite surveillance. The attack aircraft, too, at the opening of the hostilities here as a whole, possessed not only their own means of optical sighting, but also had A1 intelligence and coordinates given to them to allow their attacks to land near perfectly upon their targets, barring, of course, the fact that some Americans were well protected underground, or even within caves that weren't directly impacted by the impacting ordnance from the strikes. However, hundreds of Americans were KIA'd regardless from these munitions crashing upon their targets that were thereby successfully hit. The aircraft continued to stay in the area upon the full jettison of their munitions payloads, only then to act as strafing platforms by firing their nose cannons upon trouble areas, thus called in by the ground troops. The mountainside, by the time of the ground attack planes completing their strikes of their heavy ordnances, was now ablaze from napalm and also had areas that were flattened and completely devoid of all vegetation from the impacting high explosive HE ordnance, which had also blasted rocky areas into deadly debris upon their impact. It was only due to being well spread out and dug in that many more weren't annihilated within the opening strikes. Even so, the ground troops still had many enemies remaining to contend with, despite even outnumbering such on the ground, as they moved up the mountainside and towards their targets. Despite both sides being a kilometer apart when the ground fire began, many of the weapons wielded by both sides were fully capable of reaching out that distance, such as the heavier machine guns. But even the general purpose machine guns, in addition, were still technically within their range as well. Even mortars in particular, as well as even anti-tank armaments, could reach out that far, especially if the aforementioned were fired at certain angles, in order to effectively reach out such a length. The Chinese ground troops, though fighting uphill, had their gunship support from the regular army forces of the PLA, a brother service within the various Chinese armed services of regular military and parallel military branches. These aided significantly, having already had honed in upon a few earthen bunkers, and therefore blasting them to oblivion with their well-fired anti-tank missiles or even their rocket pods, rapidly saturating these areas directly. Rockets fired from the helos themselves in rapid salvos were a nasty weapon to be saturated by. It was a rain of splashing blasts throughout a specific area with 57mm rockets, which normally left nothing in its wake but demise and desolation. As the combat now raged, with the intensity level ratcheting up, the National Militia paramilitary troops advanced ever nearer as they also navigated the increasingly rough terrain the higher they continued climbing the slope, which in some places was perilous in terms of the cliffs present. There were also draws and spurs as the mountain was filled with such terrain features. Of course, all along with the many stark variations within the topography itself. As far as topographical features, the mountain possessed many areas of steep increases and decreases within the slopes themselves, wherein the rocky portions moved up and down, while even doing so upon the gradual upward slope itself. Meaning, there were therefore entire areas where the Chinese forces were strictly only able to move on foot, and to even access certain parts of the slope would thus require one to use climbing equipment. This, in and of itself, helped to channel the assaulting forces into very specific routes of attack, which could be easily identified by the partisans. However, be that as it were, the forces having recently moments ago being merely 1 kilometer away meant that they were making great strides in their assault and had mapped and planned accordingly, therefore having chosen the most efficient routes of attack, following the corresponding paths up the mountainside. Firing intensified ever more. This, as the Chi-Com troops now moved within 700 meters of the partisans and fired more well-aimed shots, according to the somewhat sparsely deployed optical gear that these third-rate Chinese paramilitary troops possessed. Despite not having one set of night vision optics per every single solitary man due to the multiple millions of personnel to equip in China's ginormous overall paramilitary elements, the national militia forces typically received 1 to 3 sets, or perhaps sometimes 4 sets, per every 10 to 12 man squad. This was still enough, however, to achieve optimal mission requirements by allowing for fire to still be well directed upon enemy targets effectively in the dark. In addition to the night vision equipment, there was also one set of infrared optics per squad as well. Now that the forces were closing the distance and were guided in via drones and GPS coordinates, these corresponding to their own and partisan positions as earlier ascertained by various reconnaissance assets, Chi-Com fire was thus hitting more and more accurately as they advanced. Now so, as the partisan trench systems, foxholes, and also ad hoc earthen bunkers were having more and more rounds splashing into them directly. This impacting of rounds and other ground-based weapons into the partisan positions now occurring came as heavy machine guns, general-purpose machine guns, and light machine gun fire flying amid the wall of rounds, all of which coming from many more accompanying rifles, all likewise fired together, which altogether took their toll now upon those who didn't manage to stay low enough within their positions, or those who, for different reasons, absconded from the safety of their earthen protection, only then to be brutally cut down. Such who did this thought that they'd try to make a getaway to avoid being KIA'd or captured by the Chi-Coms. These were they who ended up falling to the fire anyhow and being wiped out, or, at the very least, WIA or wounded in action. Despite some attempting such, discipline among most of the rest of the men remained a constant, whereby they fought hard and stood firm, even in the face of total annihilation by the invaders coming at them head on. The helicopter gunships, having expended their rockets and anti-tank missiles, still hovered overhead, firing their gruesomely lethal chain guns as their millimeter wave radars picked up on the many human targets on screen. These running within and the few without of their trenches. Seeing these targets, the Z-10 gunships therefore laid waste to many of them, all in a hail of massively sized 25mm blasting rounds flying out from these chain guns aboard with ammo still remaining. On the ground, Partisans and Chi-Com troops now fought at a 500-meter range, as now 50 more minutes had elapsed during the battle since the ground shooting began after the ground attack jets smashed their targets 30 minutes earlier. By this point, several dozen Chi-Com paramilitary troops lay dead upon the mountainside, along its slope moving upward. There now were just over 2 times more deceased partisans, laying likewise dead amid the unfolding ground combat, not counting those eliminated by the preliminary airstrikes carried out by the ground attack planes, who loomed and strafed whenever a partisan position gave any real trouble, such as a specific bunker or trench network. Fortunately, as the partisans were spread out amid several rows of defensive fortifications, casualties were lower than they easily should have and could have been otherwise. "Go! Send all but 20 men from the first to the second trench! Let the 20 remain! With the rest moving up, they're gonna wipe out everyone if they all stay there! That's where all their damn fire is oriented on at the moment!" yelled the National Guard major, turned partisan, loudly to one of his men from the retreating group of guardsmen, in order that he spread the message and therefore help move people further up to the next trench in order that the Chinese hit largely empty positions. This all while leaving a very tiny screening force to tentatively hold the position until the position stabilized, if such were even still a possibility, as it were. From where he commanded, Being one of the three main local partisan leaders of the overall amalgamation of forces, he sat in a bunker on the second line in the middle of the three trenches as they terraced upwards upon the mountain slope. Troy was down in the first line with the remainder of his original men, of whom they who stayed after some had been sent off among the group, escorting the non-combatant family members and infirm out of the area. This in the hopes that they'd be safer and protected with such protection of the 50 men. The rest of the men in the first line of trenches, foxholes, and bunkers were a small grouping of the Frmr Guardsmen, and some of Joseph's original men as well. They were being now brutally accosted by the onslaught levied against them by the Chinese ground troops. In addition, having also been hit by strafing from the ground attack planes still in the area and the attack helo gunship's chain guns. This kept the men's heads down, lest they be ripped off and apart, literally and figuratively speaking, which in a way prevented them from fighting their very best. This, in and of itself, is what led the Major to making his call on the situation. This had been carried out some 40 minutes later, as spreading the word under such intensive fire was extremely dangerous and therefore time-consuming. That being due to having to stop relentlessly inside of earthen bunkers and other holes amid the earthworks in order to escape the ensuing aerial attacks and strikes coming in from ground-based mortars. Finally, many of the men fled through several connecting perpendicular trenches that intersected with all three parallel bottom-to-top terraced trench systems. Many were wiped out en route, however, due to their backs to the fire as they were spotted running upwards through said trenches, onward to the second line of defensive terracing. This allowed for perhaps a few dozen more casualties from said fire, thereby honed in on them as they proceeded upwards by those means. Men fell, as many of such were viciously smacked throughout their bodies upon raising up to fire their very own weapons. This upon the closing in Chi-Com forces, now moving further up the slope, and thereby getting a now better bead upon their enemies in so doing. However, the partisans still in command of the high ground fired downwards into an attacker who increasingly had to scramble for cover to hide amid or even lay flat in the prone position upon their brief stops from bounding to cover positions, only then to hope that no enemy partisan rounds would thereby hit them while scrambling for said cover. By now, the battle had started to even somewhat slow down, as vigorous defenses met determined attackers, seemingly throwing themselves hard upon the mountainside fortress of the partisans, only then for the Chi-Coms to be slightly repulsed back down to better cover and concealment for them. This process ensued continually, as there was a sort of sparsely vegetated no man's land laying down the immediate slope away from the partisans. That particular area had lacked any sort of real undergrowth to hide within, as the trees and scattered rocks and varying topographical features were all that lay really within it. Such area was the 500 meters between the partisan positions and the different venues of approach, from where the slope began to radically change from thick forest and foliage cover to primarily just trees and rock, with still enough soil patches in plenty of areas, including wherein the partisans dug in their new base camp. There were even also cliffs and cave systems nearby as well, some of which would see usage by the partisans a bit later. As far as the cave systems themselves were concerned. But for now, there was a bit of a lull in the advance of the Chi-Coms, though not in the actual fighting itself, which turned into a sort of tit-for-tat combat, this consisting of small arms and machine gun fire, with mortars only doing slight damage due to the wise partisans having well spread out their remaining manpower, therefore not yet having been slaughtered in the opening few hours of the battle. By now, the helos and ground attack planes had to return to base to reload munitions, to refuel, and also even do a maintenance lookover insofar as services and checks in order to clear them for flight to conduct a return run, before then finally returning to continue aiding those forces still operating on the ground. As this was underway, the ground combat continued onward in its grind, despite ample destruction ever presently still occurring, due to the Americans being so well spread out. Thus, they continued to be a thorn in the side of the Chinese paramilitary troops advancing up the mountainside towards them, inching ever nearer. As matters sat currently, it would take some considerable time before the aircraft returned once again, perhaps a little over a total hour, due to maintenance and ordnance crews, both having to complete their specifically assigned tasks relating to prepping the aircraft for their second runs over the current battlefield, notwithstanding also counting the flight time to and fro as it pertained to these aircraft employed in the battle by the coalition forces. Being that the mountain itself was so massive, the munitions utilized, though considerably potent though they were, simply weren't enough to annihilate all the enemies in and of themselves, as this being due to a host of factors, not the least of which being how well dug in and spread out the partisans actually were, causing the ground troops to really have to quote-unquote get in there, as the saying went, to ferret them out to finish the task at hand. As machine guns and rifles continued their ever-present rattling, seemingly unceasing between the two sides, rounds smacked into all manner of rocks and soil, the remaining trees within the area, and into the earthen positions themselves. This, alongside of mortars and soon barrel-fired grenades from tubes beneath rifles, along with anti-tank missiles, and of course, Type 69 RPG-style rocket weapons. The thunderous booms of all the ordnance-based weapons was unnerving for the partisans, to be sure. However, they hit back with similar such weaponry of their very own in terms of the Frmr Guardsmen stocks they'd fled the Billings, Montana battle with earlier, intermixed with whatever captured Chinese weapon systems had thus far been taken from prior successful or maybe semi-successful ambushes throughout the recent several days of war. These crashed into and blasted men out of existence, and also tossed their limbs and mangled torsos in various directions, staining the soil a sort of crimson color resultant from the blood and gore. Such blood and gore, therefore, itself was regularly tossed throughout the air in misty clouds or outright torrents of leaking fluids from those cut down by the rounds and munitions. "Get down! Keep your heads down!" yelled some of the men taking charge amid the chaotic, disintegrating situation, shouting frantically over the chorus of small arms fire and blasts unfolding. All as the men ran throughout the trenches, and even others between different individual foxhole-type positions, all scattered throughout among the three large main layers of trenches that were terraced from lower to higher up in the mountain. These terraced trenches being only connected by several other service trenches running perpendicular to the main defensive trenches themselves, thereby intersecting three of them from lower to higher up. By this point, the evacuation of about nearly 100 men that had been aptly well placed out within the lowest of the three trenches had thus succeeded to where these men now joined others within the second trench for the time being. There, however, still remained a tiny screening force of about 20 others who bravely remained to hold down the first trench. This being done to keep the immediate vicinity in front of it temporarily clear of Chi-Coms as they tried avidly to get ever nearer while they crawled as flat as they conceivably could get away with. Though a few thrashings dished out upon the advancing Chi-Coms let them know they needed to stay back until they could wear down the defenders at least a bit more. After all, the partisan-like forces simply couldn't hold them at bay forever, despite occupying excellent terrain and fortress-like dug-in high ground above the invaders channeled into certain areas now moving upwards. Here, however, they definitely lacked the numbers, the training, the weaponry, and logistics, and increasingly more and more, the determination to be able to hold on to their positions, indefinitely speaking. Even so, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans fought tenaciously. As much so as was possible, considering their current circumstances, of course. The Chinese didn't even have to conduct Operation Woodsman in the way they even went about it to begin with, and certainly having the ability to carpet munition with saturation raids upon the mountain, including these partisan positions, if done in a more prolonged campaign of dropping heavy quantities of ordnance. Despite not having have done this, Lieutenant General Wu Fong was simply headstrong in his belief to bring all resistance firmly to an end within his AO, even if done for simple bragging rights, before the official end of the invasion phase was to occur, by midnight that very night, thereby making 4 days or 96 hours of the total full-scale invasion having thus officially concluded by such time. In other words, it was simply done to make a point and to advance his own personal position within the National Militia Paramilitary Command structure and within the CCP regime as a whole. Instantaneously, from within mere feet from where Joseph currently took position, men were cut down by 7.62 by 54 millimeter rounds fired by a general-purpose machine gun towards the immediate area, causing him to duck back beneath cover. Meanwhile, having done so, as also mortars impacted some roughly only 80 feet away from him as well, thereby eliminating several unfortunate men. These victims now, near one of the landing and blasting munitions. He himself, with his 03 Springfield 30-06, had been trying to aim with his night vision monocle optic, thereby attempting to pick off Chi-Coms spotted beneath the first trench. These particular troops he fired upon currently had daringly moved closer before slightly withdrawing whenever the situation became too risky for them. all as they kept carrying out localized probes of the defenses to find a weak link in the partisan fields of fire, in order that they exploit such to advance through said areas of partisan positions. However, finding none as of yet, they kept up this probing assault pattern. They did, though, know full well that sooner or later something was going to give for them, and also that they'd be able to exploit such gains whenever and wherever first discovered. All it would take was to continue to chisel away at the defenders with well-aimed rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. This, along with anti-tank missiles and RPG-type rocket fire as well. Essentially, their light infantry weapons were simply a proverbial death by 1,000 cuts, especially once their aviation helo and ground attack jet aerial assets dealt the initially required necessary blows. Such aforementioned blows to set the operation up for a resounding success, as a result of these softening up preliminary strikes. Truly, at this point, the air power wasn't even needed to obtain a final victory, although its return upon the scene would definitely sew things up much faster and easier than merely just the ground troops operating all alone. So far as men kept falling here and there, what began as roughly about 600 fighting men on the partisan side, not counting the non-combatant family members or infirm, was now whittled down to about some only 320 remaining by now, beyond several total hours into the battle. Of course, of the initial Americans wiped out in the preliminary airstrikes, many of the KIA'd were also of the non-combatants, intermixed along with some of the combatants. Though now that the rest of the non-combatants had thereby been successfully evacuated beyond such occurring, what remained was now only the partisan combat forces, which for their part were being picked apart ever gradually. Lives were continually lost, as the battle's ebb and flow was now taking a monumental shift for the worst. As, after hours of combat, the defenders were weary and combat fatigued due to the intensity of the tandem air and ground blows dished out upon them. Be that as it were, the only choice really remaining was to hold off the attackers for a bit longer. All as, of course, before a strategic withdrawal could safely occur, in order that the non-combatants earlier evacuated couldn't be caught up with or captured or wiped out by the enemy. By this point, that was what had been sincerely hoped for by the three main leaders, who actually hadn't by this point in combat even crossed one another's paths just yet. Joseph kept on shooting at individual Chi-Coms he caught within his optics, hoping that with several of the direct hits that he knew were fatalities for certain that he dished out, that it would somehow be enough to ward off the local prodding attempts. This, along with whatever damage being meted out, of course, by the other partisans with him, was likewise achieving alongside of his own efforts. He knew others were giving it their all, but all his blows weren't necessarily fatal ones, as the enemy wore body armor, and apart from this, many of his multiple shots taken had outright missed, as hitting moving targets on the battlefield was substantially difficult. That was indeed the case, especially when one was utilizing a bolt-action rifle with which they attempted to hit fast-moving targets. Were he utilizing a semi-auto rifle, he wouldn't have to regain a sight picture over and over again upon rechambering a new round, generally speaking, and also would have had the option of sending more rounds down range a bit faster at said moving targets. Even despite the fact that the 30-06 round was a highly potent, devastating round to be sure. Even with the hang-ups he faced, he did no doubt assist in causing the enemy in several sectors along the slope where they attempted to break through during their advance to have a proverbial headache. This as they lost several men as a result of strictly his own fire levied upon them. One of the former guardsmen among the amalgamation of men ran through the trench, stopping close to Joseph while carrying a tube. He looked immediately around him, especially behind, all before holding up the tube. It was an AT-4, which Joseph now recognized in the dark. Near him, as the muzzle flashes occurring seemingly everywhere, lit it up in spurts of light. He aimed and yelled, "Backblast area clear!" before a loud popping puff sound of sorts occurred in a split second as the 84 millimeter recoilless shell fired out of the now worthless tube, which was then dropped post-firing. Near instantaneously, seemingly as quick as it fired, a blast in a split second occurred perhaps 200 meters away, as the shell blasted immensely loud below the trench systems. Judging from the aftermath when looking through his NVG monocle optic, Joseph could see amid the smoke were bodies, or what remained of them, which themselves had been flung off feet away from where the blast had occurred initially, just seconds earlier. Seeing the lifeless corpses of perhaps the larger portion of what had been a squad was pretty eerie to Joseph, as merely before the AT-4 had even been fired, these perhaps 8 or 9 men were literally just charging up to the first trench line. That squad had gotten incredibly close, a sign that this area needed more intensive coverage, as this former guardsman caught the discrepancy and had rushed to fix it with his AT-4. No doubt would there be other probing attacks coming through that very direction immediately thereafter. The 20-odd men who'd been left as the first trench's screening force were all gone by now, these men laying within their last known positions, either deceased or at bare minimum mortally wounded. Hence, the Chi-Coms now were able to proceed yet even closer than they already had been. Such was the case, albeit with still enough heavy fire occurring to where they were still trying to sneak their way inwards. Even so, the fading forces of the American partisan fighters, diminishing in overall numbers, were having a harder time than even minutes beforehand holding down such a large area. Such was the case in terms of sectors of fire were concerned. Sure, Joseph, Troy, and the Major had picked a great location for this recently prepared partisan base camp, as the approaches had been easier than others to monitor, this being due to the slope having cliffs, draws, spurs, and other features breaking up the monotony of the gradual slope, wherein it required climbing gear to surmount in certain places. Therefore, such terrain made it easier to climb areas on foot and easier to monitor for the partisans. However, with manpower now dwindling, it wasn't as easy as nearer towards the beginning of the battle. By now, some 4 hours into it, it was a brutally hellish endeavor for both sides, although the partisans, of course, suffered heavier casualties to be sure. But even as such was the case, it was not a cakewalk for the attacking forces, who had to fight, literally speaking, a quote-unquote uphill battle. This upward momentum was very tasking upon the attacking foot soldiers of the paramilitary National Militia troops, despite the fact they were well-versed and well-trained in mountain warfare conditions back home in China. Such training conducted within the Tibetan Plateau and also in Sichuan province. Mountains, regardless, were the toughest conditions within which to prosecute combat, even for those who were otherwise used to it. Definitively speaking, mountain warfare was not for the faint of heart. Heart was something these partisans and their current erstwhile opponents both possessed insofar as the task at hand was concerned. But that still didn't make matters any easier as far as carrying out the combat itself within these conditions for either side of the issue now unfolding. Regular units were often not suited for this sort of fighting, thus requiring specialized mountain units, paratroopers, or other similar light infantry-styled units that could operate within such altitudes. For such reasons was the National Militia's 4th Corps chosen, due to where it hailed from within China. These men were men of great sacrifice, despite even the fact that they were part-time forces akin to what the men of the American National Guard were. This, in terms of their mission orientation and status as part-time forces within China, albeit these forces were well-trained and in excellent shape, all things considered, at least insofar as it related to the current task at hand. "We're dying down here! Help us! Get us some more men from the 3rd trench! Hurry up!" yelled Joseph, now frantic, as he watched a well-directed mortar strike impact directly a single foxhole containing 2 different men posted up there. One had a light machine gun, the other a rifle with a barrel-mounted grenade tube launching system beneath it, of whom both had no doubt been putting up tough resistance with the combo of the firepower both wielded together. One had the ability to direct small ordnance in addition to marksmanship with the rifle in order to support the machine gunner, all with the machine gunner laying down bursts of streaming lead to keep the Chi-Coms' heads down. At least such applied to those who weren't directly hit by the machine gunner's torrent of rounds themselves, all as they flew down and out of the particular foxhole. "Keep everyone spaced out, damn it! Can't afford much more loss!" he yelled again, as 2 men ran up the service trench that connected the 3 terraced trenches, with both narrowly avoiding being hit by the hail of fire, all of which splashing throughout the immediate area. Taking another several well-aimed shots, Joseph just barely missed his first mark as the Chi-Com moved rapidly out of the way upon his trigger pull. However, the second shot hit one in his body armor, thereby knocking him down as he crouched up. His third shot hit one in the head, straight on in the front. Upon this occurring, the soldier's head snapped back, and through the night vision monocle optic, he could see dark fluid flying out of the exit wound with a smaller, multiple misty droplets flying out of the entry wound. Instantly, the Chi-Com Joseph just hit, in the prone position in the head, was attempting to crawl nearer to the trenches, but now lay where he was stopped by Joseph's well-aimed shot. This caused some of the others of the same squad of the KIA'd soldier falling from Joseph's headshot just meted out to now re-vector their firepower upon Joseph's immediate vicinity. No doubt they were attempting to take him out of the proverbial picture. There was a light machine gunner with a Type 81 light machine gun and others firing their Type 56 rifles, including one firing a 25mm grenade from a tube attached beneath it. There then came a grenade strike about roughly 20 meters away from Joseph, much too close for comfort. Moreover, as also were the pelting rounds of the light machine gun and the rifle fire as well. Fortunately for Joseph, his entrenched position protected him fairly well from all the local Chi-Com retaliation against his immediate zone, whereupon he held his current position. One man near Joseph firing his AR-15 at the assault troops of the Chinese paramilitary forces was himself now hit in the head, shoulders, and chest from inside the trench where he stood firing. The thick fire coming from the Chinese was simply far too potent, and taking men out left and right Sure, the trenches and makeshift earthen bunkers and foxholes aided the survival odds substantially than would have even been possible without them, but the attackers were great in number and in weaponry, also in training and discipline tactics, and in addition, they had their earlier air and attack helo gunship firepower, which had leveled many defensive positions along the lines themselves. Now the softened up, entrenched partisan element was failing beneath the withering enemy firepower brought to bear against them. Joseph, however, undeterred, moved down the line and kept on shooting. He was acting as a sharpshooter to support the defense. While not quite a sniper, a sharpshooter was the next best type of support that Joseph could personally assist with. Certainly, there were some other men whose arms were high-quality hunting rifles and potent calibers for such a task, but against the strong Chinese force moving upon them, they could only do so much, insofar as overall damage was even concerned. Joseph fired and fired, but most of his shots missed, due to the difficulties associated with hitting moving targets. Moreover, using a bolt rifle wasn't the best weapon for taking follow-up shots on such targets, in the sense of sheer rapidity. But he got his proverbial licks in when and where possible, managing to hit a few more of the enemy troops, with even some of his shots being confirmed KIAs, but others were WIAs or completely outright misses, more often than not. Some of the Chi-Com platoons now attacking began to bring forward LG-5 magazine-fed 25mm semi-automatic multiple grenade launchers on tripods, and thus did they then let loose upon the American trenches and foxholes. Also moving forward, their W-85 heavy 12.7mm machine guns on their tripods as well. This to bring them ever closer to better lay down heavy 12.7mm fire on the American positions. This, along with everything already at the front battle lines committed to the fighting, all became a nightmare from hell to even contend with, and made many American heads stay low within their fortifications, all to where enemies advanced closer and closer, occasionally within hand grenade range, making matters that much worse. Despite this, though, the Americans gave it all they had, and barely managed to slightly fend off some of the probing attacks, making it perilously near to their lines. This as some of the squads conducting the sapper-like probing attacks, who crawled deathly close, had a few of their members picked off by men like Joseph, who could get a good bead upon those specific attackers. Joseph himself got another confirmed KIA this way, while badly wounding also yet another enemy. This particular action caused the remaining members of that particular squad to lay down suppressing fire, while other members dragged away the wounded, and also even the dead man, back to their current main battle line where most of their positions were at that particular moment, in order for the medics to work on their wounded. The dead, of course, were to be taken back to the FOB, to then be sent home to China for their state funerals with military honors. This for serving in combat and falling while so doing in the line of duty. By now, some nearly 5 hours had elapsed since the battle's inception, and the intensity level remained a constant, insofar as the current tempo was concerned. There were still Chinese probing attacks ongoing and getting worse. In fact, as far as the battles in Montana were all stacking up, this particular battle was in the top 3 most intense, along with 2 of the 3 pocket battles having it already occurred and concluded before the end of the 3rd day, with this battle producing casualties in the hundreds for not just the defenders on the partisan side, but even the Chinese by this point had officially lost in this specific battle on the mountainside some 192 men, most of whom were hit by ordnance-based weaponry utilized by the Americans, including former American Guard weapons like AT-4s and 40 millimeter tube-fired grenades, but also captured Chinese weapons now being fired back at their own forces from the partisan amalgamation of 3 different groups, now operating together as one. Apart from that, the standard small arms, including machine guns of light and general purpose, and what few heavy machine guns the partisans possessed by this point, added to the enemy KIAs also. As of this moment, there were remaining some 250 American combatants still alive and still fighting the Chinese, with of their 2 attacking truck infantry battalions operating almost exclusively now on foot, minus, of course, those riding all-terrain vehicles. And also, what companies of the headquarters battalion troops further down the mountain belonging to the 4th Corps that came to this battle. There were still over 2,400 left to contend with completely as it related to the Chi-Coms in this area, as all but 500 were left back in Butte to man the National Militia 4th Corps headquarters fortifications there. The rest of headquarters battalion, the 600-odd men within their 4 respective companies, sat lower on the slope to command the ground operation occurring and coordinate with the PLAAF, PLA, and Russian VVS, along with handling the medivacs, logistical resupply issues, or maintenance and fuel for the few all-terrain vehicles being sparsely utilized by the 2 largely dismounted truck infantry battalions. These particular combat battalions now bearing the brunt of the assault up the mountain. Before it would all be over with entirely between both battalions, each one would lose almost 170 men apiece, these casualties being somewhat evenly spaced out between the various sub-unit companies comprising the 2 battalions. For now, though, both sides kept slugging it out, as the cost shouldered by the partisans in terms of personnel was already higher than was the enemy's losses. All in all, of what would end up being just over 2/3 of their original forces then lost by battle's end as it related to the partisans. Of the roughly 250 still fighting, and now just beyond 5 hours into it, they grew ever more tired and sought to head to the other side of the mountain for safety. Despite this being the case, the irregulars knew, even so, that conducting a fighting retreat under current conditions would remain exceedingly difficult, and that it could become an all-out rout of their forces. Such an outcome, while immensely undesirable, as it would open them up to total annihilation or capture, had to be somehow staved off, as best as was even feasible by this point in the fighting. The partisans had to flee in such a way while maintaining adequate pressure on the enemy, such pressure to where they could use the terrain advantageously enough to where it would shield them, while also allowing them to move and inflict undesirable casualties on their enemy while so doing. Joseph Troy and the Major all had subordinates of theirs previously scout the area and report such key terrain information to them earlier on the 3rd day, all of course as a prerequisite of choosing the site they had to develop for their base camp. Therefore, in so doing, for setting up their base camp, the men then having had discovered precious cave systems and cliffs, and also even concealed relatively hidden pathways on the mountain, had thus decided that defensively, this area was definitely the most tenable position even worth occupying. The 3 leaders knew, relatively speaking, the whereabouts of the most important terrain features, which were therefore advantageous for defense. These, should such conditions as a fighting withdrawal even be required, or simply even just sneaking out of the battle space and then melting away into the mountainous terrain in general. Such was the course of action needing to be taken soon, and fast. However, the most reasonable, responsible thing to do was what had already been done once the blasting had begun. Evacuate the non-combatants from the battlefield and send them on their way with armed escorts for their safety, and thereby buying them ample, vital, valuable time to escape through conducting their defenses on the mountain slope. After all, no one even seen Operation Woodsman even coming, much less did they even know the name of it. It all seemed too soon and came upon them all too fast. There were plenty of reasons for such, as the Chinese were still in their full-scale invasion mode of operation for the time being, and therefore hadn't settled into more of a policing action style warfare yet, or what most refer to as counterinsurgency operations. This, despite such actions occurring already across the former nation, albeit being a hybridized form of total, complete, high-intensity warfare mixed in with aspects of lower-intensity classic CI operations. These, however, were almost a form of counterinsurgency ops that were never before seen, as they were prosecuted with the ferocity of an army militarily destroying another nation's armed forces despite being largely levied against the already defeated nation's armed citizenry, in addition to its defeated military forces. CCP ruling elites back home in China had deemed a total war of annihilation as a necessity, as they already were quite concerned with the prospects of a prolonged counterinsurgency fight. This was the line of thinking due to the sheer landmass and armed populace involved to be subdued. Therefore, part of the war planning itself was to draw as much of that out as fast as possible, only then to wipe it out immediately, as the objective, of course, was to initiate colonization procedures near instantaneously. This by sending over the first batches of colonists for the economic and financial exploitation of what now was referred to as New China. Xi wanted to strip mine the entire land immediately, right away, including even of its literal human capital, in quotes, as he called it himself. In so doing, he knew he had to rout or ferret out all forms and capacity for resistance, as to occupy such a large land and population was for certain no small task. Although realistically speaking, it was a task that only China alone, or with allies to boot, could ever have a chance of surmounting. No other nation possessed the sheer numbers of personnel under arms and armament resources than did China, with its 20 million man paramilitary forces of several different branches of such, all a parallel military force of combat-trained and armed personnel. In addition, alongside of this monumentally sized paramilitary grouping were the regular military reserve forces of another 5 million, and finally there was the 4 million man active duty military forces. All in all, some 29 million men capable and able to fulfill this obligation, thereby foisted upon them by their overlords within the CCP regime. Chinese industry, the largest on the earth, included within it the largesse of China's mighty military-industrial complex, this being by far the largest in the world in terms of output. They could marshal enormous resources for such a war and possessed the means and gigantic stockpiles of weapons to equip their forces with. China had stocks of shells of all types, well in excess of 2 billion, roughly double what Russia's massive shell stockpiles were. China also possessed the largest land-based strategic missile forces in terms of cruise and ballistic missiles of various ranges and types. In terms of vehicles, China had by far the most armored vehicles and tanks, and tied in artillery numbers with Russia. but capable of far outproducing them in more if they so chose as it related to artillery pieces. Insofar as additional stockpiles of howitzers, still mission ready in long term storage, China even already had enormous old stocks, with which a once over refurb action could immediately create multiple full new brigades of artillery, with over 10,000 additional older howitzers, but still useful, sitting in warehouses. China had the world's biggest air defense arm, although Russia was fairly close in terms of system numbers. Recently, China had begun to rapidly expand their helicopter fleet, producing hundreds of helos per year. Chinese aircraft and ship production were likewise off the charts enormous, as China was number one in steel, tungsten, aluminum, zinc, and titanium production by a huge margin, all of which critical for war production. China's population, too, was so massive, as the biggest in the world, that they could literally raise up even more armies gradually over time, in addition to all that they even currently possessed for the time being. This, as the demographics afforded China swathes of military-aged men for their various military and paramilitary branches. Really, though, it required about 12 million troops, or at bare minimum, at least 10 million forces, at the least, to occupy a landmass the size of what was now the former USA, now called New China. At first and throughout the war, the troop rotations, coupled with China's other military obligations around the world, worked out, mathematically speaking, especially with troops being contributed by allies, including Russia, who boasted fairly sizable forces themselves, though nowhere near the obvious Chinese largesse. Other allies besides China and Russia combined would add up to contributing roughly another 500,000 total expeditionary forces to the war. Joseph, however, knew nothing of any of the grandiose plans of the worldly Eastern elites running other nations, many of which became vile oppressors over the North American continent. No, rather, Joseph was concerned with getting the hell out of the hot zone and surviving the war as a whole. It had dawned upon him as he ran up and out of the second trench to the third and highest trench system that most of the men were now wiped out. Moreover, drastic future actions would need to be taken, as winter was coming upon the land in a few short months. Winter would be harsh, and adequate planning was needed in order that whosoever remained could even somehow survive. Times would be getting harder. That much was obviously certain. But if the remaining survivors of the group wanted to last, they'd need a better system in general, and the literal blessings bestowed by God Almighty. For now, making it into the third trench, he seen Troy slumped over along the downslope facing trench wall. He had been hit multiple times in the face and throat even by Chinese bullets. His head had snapped back when he had been struck down, while his body dropped as he leaned forward trying to fire upon the aggressors, currently scaling the mountainside. As such had occurred, this was where his body remained, namely slumped forward on the trench wall, where he'd been leaning on the incline of the trench. Joseph only even noticed Troy, this due to the intensity of the flickering light from the immense quantity of all the different muzzle flashes. It choked him up a bit. Not that he and Troy went far back or anything, but mostly because he was beginning to build trust and a rapport with him. Even with the former guard major also, as the third man of their unofficial triumvirate of leaders. Now, however, it really hit home. Even commanders sometimes fell in battle, and Joseph didn't want that idea grabbing a hold of him personally, as he personally felt that without such solid leadership, the entire amalgamation of combatants would literally disintegrate. Such bothered him, as he himself had done so much to aid in the development and organization of his own original Butte men, which he'd organized into miniature platoons, which he had called companies, just several days prior. Organization and communication and coordination literally meant life or death for entire organizations. He now had lost many of the original men he had brought here from Butte, all of whom had fled the disaster upon the first day of hostilities. This occurring when the massive Chinese Trojan and external invasion forces pushed not only Joseph and Sally, but many other families out of their homes in Butte, making refugees of the local people commenced when the invasion had begun. The same process repeatedly occurring thousands of times over, as many families were forced into becoming such refugees literally at the drop of a dime. These fleeing civilians taking flight from all the combat having then erupted across the land in literally all corners of it, most having rapidly left their homes early on day one, lest they ended up KIA'd or captured and enslaved as a result of not escaping quickly enough. Joseph then got his 30-06 back up, bracing it steadily upon the crest of the trench, as he leaned in upon its incline to rest his body upon it, thereby taking aim and thereby opening up on a Chi-Com having had been seen. The Chi-Com himself about to crawl and roll into the lowest first trench. Joseph's round then hitting him as he was about to crawl close enough to drop into said trench. He got a clean headshot, passing through the side of the Chi-Com's helmet and out the other side. All carried out as was seen through his NVG monocle optic mounted upon his rifle. There just was no time left, as things continued further deteriorating. Yes, some men remained still within the second trench, but communications had broken down amid all the chaos and pandemonium of combat. In addition to the aforementioned, the Americans had no radio or any other means by which to rapidly disseminate dire messages, much less to coordinate their plans or operations in better times, as it were. It was now getting down to the wire, as by this point the men of the two attacking battalions within their different companies, all pushing forward, broken up and attacking by platoon, each platoon being broken down into 4 or sometimes 5 squads, thereby comprising them. These paramilitary troops now came full on, rising up now with little fear of what might thereby happen. Such actions occurring as they now realized the partisans had been adequately enough thinned out as they'd hoped and planned on doing, achieved by their smaller, gradual, localized assaults in different avenues, all of which having been done deliberately to chisel away at the defenders. Of these battle tactics, their prosecution generally worked, all as the different platoons and their subordinate squads would crawl forward to fire, then roll downwards to escape. Upon having been conducted, they would continue these tactics repetitively, to continue returning and doing the same across the no man's land before the trenches. These were constant probing attacks whose purpose was to seek out and exploit weaknesses in the partisan defenses on the battlefield. Yes, the defenders had many advantages with how the terrain worked in their favor, but their enemy was well organized, equipped, and coordinated. Moreover, they had excellent communications via radio and combat data links, techniques and battle doctrine, and most importantly, they never deviated from their plans. Now, while they were coming currently a bit harder than before, rising up and firing, thus calling on radio and thereby signaling to more of their other companies held a bit further down the slopes, these, as the combat reserves of the battle, could now move ahead, now that the way was relatively clear to advance, without worrying about any more withering fire coming upon them from the partisans. As well as the American defenders had resisted, it all was now falling apart, despite the combat still continuing. Even so, it was almost time to conduct their fighting retreat. Earlier, the napalm strikes from the air caused a bit of terrain denial in certain areas, but the way now was more clear than it had been a bit earlier. Even so, fortunately, the surviving non-combatants made it safely out of the battle space, just barely with their lives. It was now over 6 hours into the battle by this point, and the patience of the attackers had paid off dividends. Apart from the moderate casualties they sustained. Despite that being the case, Lieutenant General Wu Fong would get his awards and honors for his victory here, as would many of his subordinates themselves, such as the lieutenant colonels leading the 2 battalions during the attack, commanding on the ground. Although the 2 lieutenant colonels led their respective battalions in the battle, they remained a safe distance, of course, from the actual combat itself. Thus were the lieutenant colonels sitting back about nearly 2 kilometers away down the slope from the partisan positions within their tracked VP all-terrain vehicles with armor plating added on these personal command vehicles for good measure. These being a local upgrade, a product of the maintenance sections responsible for such. These maintenance troops, having had done the cutting and welding work on the commander's all-terrain vehicles themselves. In addition to the developments on land, the aerial assets from the PLAAF and VVS were en route once again by this point, as were the attack helicopters of the aviation company, thereby contributed by the PLA. Freshly armed and equipped for another round of savage combat dished out from the air. Be this development as it now stood, the remaining surviving Americans would largely be fortunate enough and flee the battlefield by the time of their arrival on scene. However, some wouldn't be so fortunate and would be blasted to literal hunks of shredded meat, occurring as they attempted to pull a sort of rearguard action during the fighting retreat to cover the escape of the larger grouping, all while they bailed the area as it related to the larger group. Some roughly 150 men would slip away into the dark, pre-dawn skies prior to sunrise. Those managing to flee successfully would thereby reunite with those non-combatants who had fled under the watchful protection of the additional 50 fighting men assigned to them, who escorted them to relative safety for the moment on the other side of the mountain. Now came the fighting retreat, as the chaos was just too thick to even control, apart from Joseph running past all of his personnel that he could, this while yelling that they needed to escape, using the caves and higher up cliffs as fighting positions to bound and cover towards. Joseph did this, all while having his men conduct their maneuvers of carrying out such a fighting retreat, leapfrogging by bounding and covering in general retreat. He managed to alert about 150 men, which saved their lives by thereby organizing them and partially coordinating them to carry out these general instructions and maneuvers. However, there were about close to 50 men who were still in the second trench just below the third. These would be they who'd unwittingly be serving as a rear guard due to their continual fight against the advancing Chi-Coms while unable to receive Joseph's orders to retreat. While so doing, they'd be in short order annihilated by the heavy munitions dropped by the soon arriving ground attack jets, which, relating to this situation for a moment, caused these men to begin to wonder why the Chi-Coms fell back abruptly after just having had made it into the first trench system. all as they were nearly about to storm their positions within the second trench next. There was a method to the seemingly mad movement of the Chi-Com withdrawal. The assaulting ground troops had just got the call on their radios that their earlier air and aviation forces, from the jets and helos respectively, were both rapidly inbound. And also, the air power of the ground attack aircraft would be there to strike the trenches and foxhole cluster of the positions of the partisans within the next 20 minutes. This meant the troops had to evacuate the area, and fast, prior to the strike occurring. The helos would be showing up in about roughly 30 minutes, or in other words, 10 minutes after the jets had first arrived. Unbeknownst to the Americans still fighting, the destruction soon to be wrought upon them would wipe them all clean off the map, literally and figuratively. Though the partisans, undeterred from holding their positions by the actions of the Chi-Coms now fighting backwards, all occurring as they left their recently captured positions within trench number 1 to head towards from whence they had originally came, the Americans simply continued to return fire at the now withdrawing Chi-Coms, even while not fully recognizing why all of this was even happening. It was now way too little, simply way too late. Despite the rest of those rustled up by Joseph, even finally noticing the major had heard him yelling and likewise helped to spread the word within the third and highest trench, it came. And as Joseph, the major, and the other 150 men now slipped fairly quietly away while melting into the forested mountain, the gigantic mammoth blasting now erupted all over, along with more napalm tanks, likewise throwing molten, gushing torrents of the burning fiery liquid, once again in many different directions as was done earlier, like a volcanic eruption. However, due to there being predominantly already burned or blasted trees and generally rocky terrain in many spots, the napalm burned for a while but gradually would go out after some time, as had occurred previously. Although the napalm burned enormous areas of tree to the ground and stayed burning for quite a long time, it would eventually burn itself out. But now that more had been dropped once again, the process from earlier was simply repeated and was definitely no less devastating as a result of such. And the heavy 1,000-pound and 500-pound HE munitions likewise threw rocks and even boulder-sized stones and dirt and remaining trees in the area and areas of soil into eruptions of such, amid also all the shrapnel. Thus were these blasts turning other natural materials into deadly, destructive, additional projectiles themselves. Joseph and the others, now slipping away upon a beaten mountain path, worn out from frequent usage by bears or whatever else had lived that high up in elevation, now gazed down at the enormity of the destruction now laying waste to a roughly 2 by 4 kilometer area, which itself was a fairly large area, but on the mountainside as a whole, was itself only on one side of its near peak. In other words, Joseph, the major, and what remained of their men were about 700 meters higher up, nearer to the summit at the time of the airstrikes. Also, for that matter, they were still close enough to have eardrums ruptured and feel the searing heat of the erupting napalm tank munitions, as well as also feeling the ground shake from the blast of the HE munitions with it. like an earthquake. It was all so intense that it felt as if the mountain was perhaps itself an erupting volcano, and that they were on the verge of being taken along with its eruption. Fortunately, they were just barely at a safe enough distance from the blasts, and the napalm as well. By this time, as the napalm savagely burned portions where trenches that Joseph, Sally, Troy, the Major, and many other combatants and their families worked and toiled so very avidly to construct were now nothing more than a blasted, burning hellscape of searing napalm amid a now blasted out moonscape of terrain, both coexisting in a destruction of unimaginable size. Even as a precision strike, it leveled massive amounts of land into sheer ruination. Even as the area sat ripped up and burning in parts of it, the ground attack planes did dives in order to strafe the area savagely with their nose cannons from both the PLAAF JH-7 Flying Leopards and the VVS Su-34s. Both aircraft were wildly potent ground attack planes, and some of the best such aircraft dedicated to that purpose in the entire world. The JH-7, while similar in some ways to the Panavia Tornado, but better in many aspects, was a superb strike aircraft and well suited in its role as such. As was the Russian Su-34, a sleek and beautifully aerodynamic Russian warplane, likewise serving well for ground strike missions. Before America was brutally crushed in the invasion, the Americans possessed the A-10 Warthog, likewise formidable in a ground attack role. However, the depleted, woke, and ill-prepared American armed forces lost 99.8% of their air force on the ground on day one's opening, including all of those fine aircraft. Of the other 0.2% lost was the scant few amount of jets airborne on training or routine air patrols during the start of the invasion, all of which were lost in very short, rapid air-to-air combat, with several also shot down by Chi-Com Russian air defense units. Now, after minutes of pulverizing the area with not only the hail of enormously destructive munitions utilized, but also the nose cannon blasting tip ammo, the aircraft were called off finally, as the ground troops and the Z-10 attack helicopters would easily be able to take matters from where the aircraft thus left off at. Such essentially was basically what occurred next. The paramilitary troops of the 2 battalions of the 4th Corps of the Chi-Com National Militia moved in to carry out what more or less would be essentially a battle damage assessment as opposed to any further combat, as they, as of the second airstrike, had unanimously achieved victory in the battle. However, as proper irregular forces often do, they melt away into the countryside, or in modern cases, sometimes within urban terrain as well. But here, it would be a more of a classic guerrilla/partisan uprising against an occupation, taking it old school with outdoor, forest, and mountain fighting. Very much like had occurred within Southeast Asia for the Americans in the latter part of the 1960s to early 70s. Such would see a similar return of fire bases, combat outposts, and FOBs, all constructed not only within the rural towns and communities, but also higher up within the forested mountains, and even within some of the high mountain valleys, of course also with many being along important roads. There, likewise, would be heavy strategic carpet munitioning campaigns, not even all that dissimilar from those occurring in Vietnam, as well as a myriad of tactical ground strikes from aircraft dedicated to such that had never before been seen in terms of the ferocity. Of the aforementioned, this was to be carried out, as JH-7s, Nanchang Q-5s, and also even fighter jets as well, of course lacking the need for use in air superiority missions, as such was already acquired immediately upon the first day. Therefore, during much of the entire invasion, fighter jets would even be utilized as ground attack assets. Such would be done, as this would see fighter jets become armed up essentially with free fall, laser guided, or some satellite guided munitions, all of different types, all therefore carried out to aid the ground campaigns, instead of typical standard air-to-air ordnances, thereby being utilized for fighters for shooting down other aircraft. As of the moment, however, the invasion officially was still ongoing, as it was the final official day of it, as its last day. By the time Lieutenant General Wu Fong's forces reported back from upon their large success upon the mountain, he felt a feeling of relief at this development, all as the now arising partisans were presenting issues as of lately, though minuscule that they were for the time being. Now it seemed they received their crushing defeat at the hands of his Fourth Corps, which itself was already spread throughout much of southwestern Montana, including along its western state line all the way inland to Butte, which was his personal headquarters for his entire corps. Now, with the announcement of the official capitulation of the country coming in on the radio, from other command elements far above his own, he felt vindicated of his personal initiative seemingly paying dividends, thus itself having been completed well before the invasion's official ending that very day at midnight. By 7 a.m., all Chinese and Allied units began receiving the recorded message of capitulation, these containing the order of official ceasefire of all organized American regime forces to occur at midnight that very night. Finally, it seemed for Lieutenant General Wu Fong that his AO, his sector, was fully secure now, perhaps. He felt confident that he could now rest easy, as all the pockets along the state line and the local American National Guard Army forces were crushed right away, too. Furthermore, Operation Woodsman, to top it all off, was another smashing success, literally and figuratively speaking. What he wasn't aware of was that although he wiped out a vast majority of what could be future partisan resistance within his specific AO, he didn't get all of it. Nor did he realize that with the advent of rampant nomadism and semi-nomadism now being adopted by the Americans, thereby coming into fruition due to accompanying cache sites to support logistical requirements, all for these frequently moving resistance forces. Also, that essentially finding and stomping them all out would become ever more difficult as such, even despite all the surveillance and intelligence gathering technologies and even superior weapons and coordination of their vastly better organized, bigger forces. All of such still wasn't enough to watch every single solitary area all the time, literally at all times. Although they could watch massive tracts of land, and frequently, there were patches in the grid of surveillance that could and would be exploited by the partisans. This as groups continually shuffled around, making pinpointing them somewhat more difficult. Joseph and the Major, now as dual group leaders, without Troy, led their remaining men and now family members. This upon locating them on the other side of the mountain and hidden, tucked out of the way. There were now some 200 remaining fighting men left in total from the 150-odd men who escaped destruction narrowly on the other side of the mountain, along with the other 50 who served as escorts for the non-combatants and the infirm. Also, there were some less remaining non-combatants left as well, as several hundred perished during the first round of airstrikes, these airstrikes leaving under nearly 410 remaining of them from almost the 700 originally. Thus, losses coming out of the nearly original 600 fighting men and their 700 non-combatant families or the injured and infirm. The group had been brutally gored by the violence that had claimed many from among the remaining survivors, with only some total now left of 612, including the Major and Joseph among that number. Now it came down to the proverbial brass tacks of having to figure out how exactly to even survive the harsh winter ahead, not to mention the literal harsh realities that came with such conditions. It was already fall, which was already quite a cold season within the climate of Montana as a whole. Soon it would become unbearably cold. Fortunately, there would be solutions, albeit labor-intensive ones. Once again, however, everyone would thus need to contribute yet again to ensure the survival of the whole group. For the time being, the Chinese were satisfied with their so-called pacification of the area, having crushed its local Air Force and Army National Guard units during the invasion, as well as swarms of armed civilians, they being largely the hardy mountain people of the area who, they themselves, were sent reeling by the ferocity of the invasion as a whole, including its many battles wherein large groups of them were completely, utterly slaughtered, wholesale, as a result. The people had the heart, the will to fight. However, they lacked overall experience, training, coordination, organization, communications, and enough adequate weaponry. At least, that was the case for the time being. There were some exceptions relating to those of experience and training, of course, as there were some combat veterans and others who at least had the training, even if they hadn't been to combat. However, most did not, and suffered immensely for it, as their lack of tactical knowledge allowed for many to become easily trapped by enemy doctrines and tactics, and thereby be just as easily destroyed as a result. Not to mention the enemy's superiority in weapons, communication, coordination, and numbers to boot. It remained a slaughter fest upon the American people throughout the entire war, as it turned into a nasty war of subjugation, occupation, extermination, genocide, slavery, attrition, counterinsurgency, and uprising, comprising all of the aforementioned as descriptive titles for the overall conflict style now at hand. Lasting for years, the war would be like a refining fire, one in which most would be burnt up within it as literal impurities, as the saying went, as such impurities are refined out of gold or other metals by using such means. Those who survived at the end would be of the finest proverbial gold in terms of abilities, practical knowledge, real life skills, and being applicable with such. All of this, of course, in the proverbial sense, but nonetheless an excellent description of the aforementioned. Those enduring and making it through the immense hardship would birth a tiny but new warrior tribal culture, as had at one time existed within the Americas before the Europeans had even first arrived. Such would occur again, albeit with a modern twist, while mixing in aspects of the Flintstones as a description of the primitive conditions within which the remaining people would learn to live within the confines of. These factors would ring true, as civilization would be literally set back millennia from all the ensuing destruction and resultant devastation wrought on by the war upon its final ending and conclusion. Joseph, who didn't understand all that was in store within the future for he and his wife, or the other men in their families, only hoped that he was worthy of being a good chieftain for the group. He, of course, alongside of the major also, who had some applicable military organizational skills as useful as were Joseph's. Despite Joseph himself never having been a combat veteran during his time in the Marine Corps, he still possessed useful skills and training, which aided decisively to organization and training of subordinate partisans. These, who by and large lacked any experience or training initially, as it related to the vast majority of the manpower of the overall partisan forces. Although an enlisted man, Joseph had very much real hands-on experience, at least, insofar as tactical training itself was concerned, and he became an NCO and led small units while in the Marines. He merely, as a current leader, simply applied his small unit leadership skills to larger forces, of which he currently now helped to lead, as the group settled into a cave complex on the other side of the mountain. He had men and their families now go off to hunt, and others to gather water from local mountain springs. These earlier had been discovered, which themselves fed into the beginnings of various tributaries flowing out from the mountain. The group was famished, as of recent experiences thereby suffered, and the captured MREs and bottled waters the people carried began to grow short in supply. They now had to, or at least until new supply raids on the enemy could be carried out, become a hunter-gatherer tribe of people. This now applied insofar as the group was concerned. There were no other options, but there was still enough ammo for hunting and defense. And of course, basic items for water collection from the clean sources discovered in the mountain. Among the fleeing family members, comprising most of the numbers of non-combatants, they fled with whatever else belonged to they as a group. Such was done by each person doing their own individual part to carry off whatever remained of the food, tools, and other supplies belonging to them as a partisan element. Such items were those taken from the extremely brief, partially successful earlier raid on Butte, conducted by Joseph, as well as other tiny raids on small local Chi-Com elements, had been conducted by Troy's group as well, down by Bozman. Such occurring prior to the amalgamation with the roughly 110 guardsmen who fled the Billings, Montana battle, and also even with Joseph's group as well. Even so, it wasn't quite enough to make it through the winter as a whole. Henceforth, the avid need to hunt and even gather water or whatever edible plants existed for augmentation of the remaining food supply. MREs taken also were helpful for the combatants to rapidly meet their caloric requirements needed for soldiering. This, as such food was specifically tailored for achieving such ends. Although the remaining food supply was minuscule relative to the long-term needs of the group, for the time being it would stave off at least an immediate crisis, as without the food and water needs met, there would have been a catastrophe of epic proportions for the group. Such being the case, all as they traversed the mountains to escape the Chi-Coms by steadily now moving around as nomads. Joseph now could see that becoming regular nomads would be the only means of survival, even though Operation Woodsman only happened by a devastating chance, due to an overzealous lieutenant general over the 4th Corps, himself rapidly having planned the operation based off of erstwhile intel from reconnaissance assets. Of the aforementioned, they had obtained a sighting only due to a clearing in the trees, thus giving the partisan group away, as some of their members were spotted. This, as well as acting upon the intel by thereby concocting an interdiction and assault plan within record time, which was only even possible to begin with by all of the invasion resources and logistics being available in enormous quantities in order to carry it all out. Such had been done in tandem with the PLA, PLAAF, and Russian VVS even as well, all cooperating with the Lieutenant General's plans. In other words, had the stars all not have aligned, the operation likely wouldn't have even occurred in the manner that it did, which especially was true due to Lieutenant General Wu Fong having already been flush with local victories by all the pockets he had crushed with his forces during the core of the invasion phase within its first 3 days. However, he just couldn't resist going after a proverbial potential thorn in his side in the form of the amalgamated local partisan groups, including that of Joseph's. Thus, due to his headquarters battalion being in Butte, which was the headquarters location of not only him personally, but over the entire 4th Corps, and a major logistical station. This logistical station, which had been there since the Trojan shock armies had even manifested, thereby itself transitioned to becoming the logistics and station for 4th Corps, as whatever remained of the logistics intended for the externals moving in now became theirs. All remaining supplies of all types became the property of 4th Corps. Of course, once the passing externals who had thus passed through days before had therefore already used it for its fuel, vehicle parts, ammo depot, food and water, and other miscellaneous items. All the aforementioned were there originally to be used as a service, maintenance, fuel, and armament station for the previous passing units. Beneath the control of Lieutenant General Wu Fong, it was now his unit's surplus logistics, all in addition to what his 4th Corps headquarters battalion and subordinate headquarters companies belonging to each of the combat battalions had initially brought along with them insofar as logistics were concerned. While sent reeling from the heavy blows dealt upon them, the partisan group of now Joseph and the Major still remaining were about to regroup and conduct themselves very differently as a result of a very harsh lesson learned from the mountain battle having had just occurred. As they sat in mountain caves out of sight of the Chi-Com and Russian recon assets of various types, they plotted their next moves, hoping that they could survive. As they conversated over the course of many hours, even as the other side of the massive mountain was now smoldering, burnt, blasted up, and filled with the scattered remains of the deceased, brave men and even women of the families of the fighting men were therefore obliterated, totally annihilated, all by the massive payloads of heavy ordnance and also even tandem napalm strikes together. Now, it was nearing noon, and the group was settling down well within the caves, although in addition, they also realized they had to be concealed and well hidden, including those out conducting the hunting and water gathering. By this time, many in the group, exhausted and mentally worn out from what had just occurred that morning, were now sleeping. There was literally no time to mourn the dead, to complain, to moan, and to whine, to do anything but survive. Everyone within the entire grouping of partisans hiding in the mountain all understood this to be the way things were now. Whether they liked it or not, they still had to accept it. They already had the hardy nature generally present within the local mountaineer population, generally speaking. These were much tougher people than were most Americans and understood hard work and hardships, not present in urban or suburban living, and more. They could be quite self-sufficient in many areas, which gave them an overall edge in survival while under the current harsh circumstances of the occupation. All of them were now thrust into a situation that they neither had control over nor any say in where the events would end up. All they could do, really, was care for themselves in a tribal sense, also learn from any recent mistakes, and take what experience had thus far been obtained and thereby put it to great use. Some, though not all, within this particular partisan group had military backgrounds, including the now former Guardsmen, still alive after the most recent battle having had occurred that very morning, who were still present among the amalgamation of people in the group. They all had, in the past few days upon making contact with each other, grew close and continually got to know each other as time passed. Yes, indeed, it was true that the American armed forces and regime had been defeated by the early morning of day number 4 of the invasion within the smoldering, smoky, ripped-up, devastated ruins of the former national cap city. But not all the people throughout the land would accept anything less than that the foreigners all go home. This, however, was something the foreigners didn't intend on doing, and instead would stay many brutal years, as this was their hard-won colony now. American people were to become their slaves, whether they liked it or not. Of course, those still free and on the lam weren't going to have any of that. Many instead opting to fight to the bitter end. Hours passed as the day went on. Joseph, who took a nap after the harrowing, exhausting combat of the previous and fairly large battle on the mountain, now awoke in the late afternoon. He decided he wanted to go on a very secretive scouting mission to explore around the entire mountain and its surrounding areas and neighboring valleys for not only new sites, but sites that wouldn't be likely to be areas wherein CHICOM personnel would bump into them while on patrols. Such were the mountainous, sparsely populated regions of Montana and neighboring states. As there was ample empty spaces, these thereby filled with lush vegetation and forests and superb terrain as had been offered in their last embattled base camp. They would find other such places to move between every other day, as that would be a reasonable timetable for rotations as a now nomadic tribe, a warrior tribe to be exact. For the time being, where they sat upon the other side of the mountain from where the battle occurred, including even higher in altitude that before, realistically, moving soon due to previous actions would be ideal. Hence, Joseph choosing to go off and scout alone to look for new places. Others had returned from hunting after many hours of so doing, some with squirrels and others with a 4-point buck. It was a decent quantity of meat to augment the remaining food stocks they still possessed. If spread out right, it was almost 200 pounds of meat between all that had been successfully hunted. Therefore, it could temporarily feed the remaining people left when mixed with the other food still left. Even so, hunting would need to become a daily requirement to further stretch things out. Another positive development for the group is that they did manage to possess several fishing rods, which meant others could be assigned to fishing to aid in meat procurement for the group. Truly, every little bit helped. Joseph again kept thinking about raids on enemy stocks, primarily weapons, associated ammo types, and food and bottled clean water. Such was a necessity within the parameters of survival. Other items such as enemy clothing, sleeping bags, and other survival items tailored for wilderness areas were likewise a must-have. These, insofar as it related to targeted items from raids. Joseph kissed Sally, his wife, who for a minute refused to let go of Joseph, likely due to legitimate concerns for his safety as she harbored such after the horrifying airstrikes in the earlier battle. He then reassured her he would be all right, and informed the major, his co-leader of the partisan grouping, he was going alone to scout the area and would return in the night. Of course, the now former National Guard major would fulfill the typical role and duties required of leadership and security for the group. thereby posting guards and even further training and organizational work over the combatants remaining within the group in order to finally hone all of their skills so that they didn't get rusty. Such being carried out was thus catching up some of the regular men to more of the ability and tactical knowledge already possessed by all the former military men within the group. Not that the straight up civvies among the group now didn't possess a little battlefield experience. It was that because they didn't fully understand basic tactics and small unit operations, that simply they were blessed to even still be alive and thus needed to refine their personal capabilities via additional tactical training. The major truly believed in this, as would have Joseph were he not setting off alone to achieve other group aims in so doing. After all, Joseph's scouting would fulfill a dire need of the group to acquire intel on the area in all manner of aspects. Thus, Joseph was playing a dire key role in finding the group's next location to move to as nomads, while ensuring group safety while so doing. Joseph was quite a tactically astute man as a former non-commissioned officer within the Marine Corps. He knew what he was doing, albeit even though he chose to go alone, which was also wise after all that occurred, because the recon assets of the enemy found them as a large grouping gathered together at the time the attack occurred leading into it. Joseph, however, as a single man, would most likely not even be noticed. Even were he to be, he would most likely be considered a very low priority target as a single man. He moved down the mountain, headed south from the group's current position nearer to the summit, doing so all while staying on their current side of the massive mountain. Going straight down worn paths through the foliage and undergrowth where he now found himself, he realized fully that at least finding his way back would be fairly easy, as there was basically only one way to go to find the others, this being, of course, going straight up the mountain again on its eastern face. He moved along, avoiding cliffs and other dangerous features where he could fall and perish. Even if it were just broken bones, he might net in some areas. Proceeding with extreme caution was most certainly a necessity during this type of foot recon. After a few hours, he reached a cliff overlooking the valley. It was a high valley up in between the mountains, which itself boasted a single road running through it. As he gazed upon it from atop the cliff, yet while also still beneath tree cover, having not moved beyond it, he could see that it was eerily quiet at that moment. Joseph wondered to himself why the Chi-Coms didn't have checkpoints there yet, or anything else just yet. He looked at it. It was a beautiful scene, like a landscape painting of breathtaking scenery from his current purview. It truly was God's creation, in all its glory. The stream, running low alongside the road, sat in a deep ravine beside it, as it bended and flowed alongside the road just below it. It being only a 2-lane road with dual yellow stripes, but was wide enough still to support heavy vehicles, should such occur if passing through. As of the moment after 20 minutes of personally surveying it, came the sounds of engines. In his own mind, Joseph had spoken too soon, wondering why there were no Chi-Com forces there. Well, as the saying went, speak of the devil, and he appears, which had never rung more true. Rumbling now became even louder, as down in the valley now came truck after truck, covered trucks with their back coverings removed. Soldiers sat upon benches in the backs, and there were quite a few of them. It was truck infantry paramilitary troops of the Chinese National Militia 4th Corps. The same types of troops fought earlier, perhaps in a different company. Obviously, they too were patrolling. Here, Unlike at the earlier battle, they could utilize their vehicles to full effect. Among the trucks, there were also 2 Tiger MRAPs as well, with potent crew-serve weapons mounted atop the gunner's hatches. One had a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, and the other an HJ-12 anti-tank missile system on its turret. As were likewise armed the cabs of the covered trucks, with their gunners standing upon the consoles within the insides of the cabs. These consoles themselves also served as gunners' stands for the hatches in the roofs of the trucks, by which the gunners could stand atop and protrude from outside of the hatches. Within the backs of the trucks themselves, each carried about 2 squads apiece, about some 20 dismounts in the back, with the 2 in front being squad sergeants above all the privates and also the corporals, driving and gunning respectively. Sergeants were serving as gunners and likewise also as the truck's TCs as well, over the trucks, in command of them, with the corporals driving. Joseph watched quietly as he crouched down within the undergrowth of his forested hiding spot. He knew damn well he was finished if somehow he were to be spotted. The firepower of all the crew-serve weaponry was phenomenal, along with that of the dismounts as well in the backs of the vehicles themselves. There came 4 trucks with the 2 Tiger MRAPs. It was the better part of a company element, perhaps 3 platoons or maybe 2 at the very least. Observing them driving through, they finally passed the area and on down the road, allowing Joseph to raise back up safely. He sighed a sigh of relief. Continuing on, Joseph now turned to look for a way across the valley, within which it did have tree covering nearer to the road in many areas, in order to cover his movements across. He then hiked down to a rocky ledge beneath the forested canopy and started to safely climb down, as the grade of its slope wasn't very menacing there. In some ways, it was almost a natural staircasing of sorts in certain spots. He then reached a lower ledge with an easier dip, moving down to more gradually sloping soil, with undergrowth amid the forested cover above. He looked up, with the leaves now changing colors. It wouldn't be long before the group would need strictly evergreen cover. There were plenty of evergreen coniferous trees to guard IR signatures within the forested mountains. However, he needed a high enough concentration of such trees and plants, as there were hundreds total personnel left remaining within his group after the savage, brutal combat of the earlier morning battle. Joseph thought to himself that he was beyond relieved that Sally, his wife, had made it out, escaping with the others alive to the other side of the mountain. He literally gave praises to God Almighty for protecting him and his wife, which constituted his family, from all the evils that had befallen the land, its people, and even his group. He felt that God was literally there, keeping him safe, blessing him, as there were many instances of near-death occurrences for him already. And surely it was no small matter that he was still here and breathing and walking and talking. Soon after thinking about these issues and personal concerns and such, he found a crossing point further down the valley floor where the creek and road actually moved through the forested canopy. Perfect! Joseph ended up saying to himself out loud as he looked up and seen the tree cover crossing over the valley floor. He looked both ways on the road, peeking his head up near it as he climbed the incline of the accompanying ravine alongside it containing the creek. "No one! Excellent!" he said again, as no sounds of vehicles were heard, as the Chinese forces had left by that point. He then bolted across it, making great haste, just for good measure. He then looked back, as he started to climb some rocks protruding from the soil, these being amid plenty of undergrowth and typical foliage among the trees. He followed it up and to the southeast, continuing onward for several more miles, all as he moved, staying within the area's valley. He was now upon a ridge by this point, following it in order to have a more panoramic view, trying to obtain such a view of the valley and other side from which he'd earlier crossed from further back away from his now current position. Soon he was nearing some mountain homes while proceeding on foot. This development occurring where the valley road split off into other paved mountain roads. He then came to a decision, choosing to begin checking some of the homes. He had brought the family's AKM rifle he'd earlier allowed Sally to use for a personal defense weapon, in addition, as well as his Springfield 30-06, he now being low on ammunition for it. However, the AKM now slung over his back had plenty. He had captured Chinese ammo used in their Type 56 rifles, which equipped big elements of their massively sized third-rate paramilitary forces of the National Militia. This ammo was the same type utilized within his AKM. It was 7.62 by 39 millimeter. He also had some of his original Wolf brand ammo for his AKM as well. He would end up needing his firepower, although he sought to avoid confrontation, of course for all the obvious reasons. He was, after all, quite alone, with no one else to help him if things went wrong. He wore his body armor with steel sappy plates, thereby giving him a sharp defensive edge from Chinese rifle ammo. Both the standard 5.8 by 42 millimeter of the enormous Chinese military and PAP paramilitary forces, and of course the 7.62 by 39 used by the third-rate troops of the Chi-Coms. Even so, larger general-purpose machine gun ammo like the 7.62 by 54 millimeter could be also withstood as well. Despite such being the case, one headshot or bleeding out from multiple extremity hits, and he'd be done for. Joseph still had to be extremely careful, in other words. This, no matter what the case for him was at the current moment. His curiosity still got the better of him as he proceeded onward to the first home. This home lay off of where the road bent towards the southeast a bit more. He now aimed, raising his hunting rifle to the low-ready position as he approached the house up its gravel driveway off of the road. It sat high up on a huge property in the forest and even had a metal pole-style gate at the very bottom of its driveway entry point. What Joseph didn't know, and probably should have known with his military background and now current combat experience along with it, was when he seen the movement of enemy forces earlier, he should have assumed there were some sort of additional activity occurring within the area, beyond just a simple convoy patrol. Essentially meaning enemy troops were likely dropped off to conduct long-range foot patrols. Though the trucks weren't empty who passed by, in all fairness, it didn't mean there weren't other elements dropped off by other vehicles elsewhere. Though he never served before in any prior American wars, as his unit had never deployed in time for such patrols were often carried out by the Americans in Iraq and Afghan. He now hiked up to the home, a beautiful, almost log cabin-styled large house with some stone work present. Probably belonged to some millionaire or something, perhaps a summer home. Might be some useful supplies inside, most likely. Hopefully the enemy didn't get whatever is inside first, he said out loud to himself, albeit quietly, as he moved forward ever more. As he moved up and upon the house, he then stacked against it, with his back against it, and edged towards a corner with his back pressed to the wall. This large house wasn't damaged by war, at least not currently. It lay very far out of the way and likely wasn't involved in any firefights, and for certain no air or artillery strikes of any sort. He looked around the corner and in all directions from where he now was in relation to the home. He then, upon seeing nothing threatening, moved around to the nearest door. It was a back door up a tiny staircase with about 8 steps onto a wooden deck that once had a working hot tub and screened-in porch. Next, he opened the screen door to the porch, which wasn't locked in any sort of manner. Entering in, he then proceeded to try the door handle to the back door, which was locked. He then smashed the glass and reached in and to unlock it and allowed himself in. Heh, I'll just let myself in, I suppose, Joseph said out loud as he chuckled a bit to himself. He was going in and was amid a beautiful, well-lit by the sun kitchen through its windows, definitely the kitchen of a well-to-do family. It was decorated with rustic signage and artsy decor. Something of a woman's touch for sure, he thought to himself, now as he slung his Springfield 30-06 while switching it out for his AKM, thereby putting it on his back. Moving with his rifle at the low-ready position, he stacked along walls and carried out room clearance style tactical movements around the house, checking the whole building for any potential threats. That is, if he could even somehow survive were he to find any, as he was all alone. Joseph was all alone, and enemy troops traveled in proverbial packs. Finding nothing on the above-ground 2 floors, Joseph then proceeded to inspect the basement next. Opening the basement door, he walked down the flight of steps with his rifle ready for any potential trouble. He weaved through the clutter of the basement, not yet looking for any valuables, as he needed to ensure the building was all the way clear first. Finally, satisfied, he went back upstairs upon noting via his NVG monocle optic within the dark basement that there could be useful tools and other items stowed away in the basement. There was no power, as the cyber attack had shut off all the power, so there was no using the light switches. Going upstairs, he rifled through the kitchen, looking for food and perhaps water. He discovered plenty of canned and dry goods, and also coffee, sugar, and bread that had now become moldy due to time out of date. Despite this, the rest of the edible items were still serviceable in his mind. He could only carry a very limited amount, so he went upstairs into the master bedroom in search of an additional bag to perhaps be able to carry even more. He went into the walk-in closet thinking a backpack or something of the sort could be found. It was men's clothing on one side and women's on the other, husband and wife for sure. He looked and found nothing apart from women's bags, which were totally useless. So he went to check the rest of the bedrooms. There were 2 other ones, one appearing neat and tidy, sort of like a guest room perhaps, the other an older boy's room. Finally, he found a black school backpack which he could fit the coffee, the sugar, and some packs of smokes he even found in one of the bread boxes on the kitchen counter. Perhaps some canned goods also for the road and bottled water. He was getting hungry and needed to eat. He then went and started stuffing his new bag full of vital food and luxury items. Coffee by now, and sugar, were literally considered as luxury items by this point in the war already, only by day 4. While he did this, there was a Chinese national militia platoon on a long-range foot patrol, having had been dropped off from a truck and a Tiger MRAP, respectively. Moreover, they were now inbound, having been placed in the area to check the homes for either civilian stragglers or refugees in hiding, and of course for enemy combatants as well, needless to say. Joseph had ideas of possible threats as he approached and even cleared the house, but his desire for creature comforts while doing his mission potentially thrust him into a situation within which he might not escape. As he finished putting the coffee, sugar box, cans of beefaroni and mini raviolis and even canned vegetables and fruits into the bag, he reached up and across the counter to grab the smokes and a few lighters, and right out the damn window was the enemy. Shit! Here too? Of course they're here, dipshit! These are human settlements. You know better! This is prime territory for activity. Joseph chided and ridiculed himself as the platoon broke into its 4 squads of 10 men each, with also its platoon sergeant and second lieutenant platoon leader also along. The group was in typical wedge formations. As they approached the home, were well spread out, coming at it from 3 different sides. One squad swung around from the northeastern approach, one from the further southeastern approach, and 2 in the middle of them. The 2 in the middle, one squad followed the other behind it in their wedge formations. It was a sort of flanking maneuver to ensure that if anyone tried to escape, they'd intercept them successfully by being able to observe all sides in this way. Obviously, they were checking all the still standing, isolated mountain homes along this road. Long-range patrols were of the sort that would stay out in the field for prolonged periods before then being picked back up and returning to their FOB or combat outpost from whence they'd come. Joseph understood these things as well as why it was happening. For him personally, the entire situation was a colossal screw-up, and that was putting it very mildly. Shit! What do I do? How the hell am I supposed to get out of this? He said out loud, albeit in a low, snappy tone. He was deeply concerned and had his AKM ready. It was semi-auto, owned before the invasion occurred, but this, and perhaps a Springfield 30-06, would be all he had in the face of a larger, more superior, vastly better armed force than he, as a single man, would be in such a situation. He ran to near the back door, and pressing up against the wall beside it, he barely turned to glance quickly out into the yard. One squad approaching from the northeast in the forested backyard was now only 40 meters or so away, and close enough that it was a miracle no one seen him, yet. Perhaps it was a fortunate combo of the sun's light glaring off the window, as well as the screen from the back porch, further providing a visual obstruction. Whatever it was, exactly, they didn't see him, but he sure seen them. He now ran into a living room which faced the southwest and away from the approaching troops. Surely what they'd do would be to leave a few squads outside and send in the other 2 as stack teams, tactical teams, to clear the property. If he had to fight during an escape, he'd need to really make it count. He had no hand grenades, as he didn't think to bring any, just his 4 total magazines for his AKM, including the one currently in the rifle. Otherwise, he had 2 boxes of 20 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. Of course, totaling 40 there, plus 5 in the rifle currently. He had to get near the window. It was going to be quite risky. His only choice, seemingly, would be to shoot out the living room window and jump out. He needed cover to make his big move and literally hope God would spare him from breaking any bones or spraining anything during his fall. He was wearing heavy body armor with steel sappy plating after all. As it came time, he could hear footsteps on the deck, and he knew what was about to be next. Pfft! There went the doors. And literally within 1 literal second, they rushed in from front and back doors. Seeing Joseph there, it got ugly still within a literal second. Immediately. In literally 1 second, Joseph shot the window out, all while then turning immediately with cat-like reflexes to shoot at the enemy stack teams as they likewise opened fire upon him, all occurring in a literal split second as they entered and spotted him there. Joseph, as he jumped out the window, kept his head low, bent near his chest in order to prevent it from hopefully being shot off by the Chi-Com stack teams. Being cut by all the glass shards was now barely noticed by Joseph while he carried out his evasive maneuvering. He bailed extremely fast, having tossed out the bag while jumping even with his 30-06 slung over his shoulder and AKM in hand. He landed with a hard thud, his landing occurring upon the incline of the side yard slope adjacent to the home's southwestern side facing where he had come in. His hard landing was barely noticed by his body as he bounced right back up in another split second and away from the Chi-Com platoon of troops now viciously hunting him. Troops now pursuing him, all yelling in Mandarin to surrender and drop his weapon as they formed up into wedges out of their squads, all while opening up on Joseph. While such was occurring, those inside the home that had broken in proceeded to the window he had just jumped out, now firing out of it, all in response to being aware that he had fired back at them quickly upon their breaking into the home. He ran and turned and fired back a few times as he kept moving, this as they kept firing, while he hoped to slow them down by occasionally returning fire to get them to put their heads down or stop in their tracks and hit the prone position. There were by then 2 squads that had entered the home, with one still required to clear the whole home in case there were others besides Joseph still inside, with the other squad at the window tactically shooting at him as other squad members filed out of the window after him, as such now occurred along with the other 2 squads that had waited outside initially, now rounding the home on either side of it to shoot at him as he bolted like a madman. Joseph now running in random zigzagging patterns in order to make hitting him become all the more difficult. It all happened so quick, within a matter of short seconds, when all combined, from the time the door was kicked in to him bailing out of the window and running. All of this as rounds now splashed everywhere, smacking everything all around him. This, of course, included the extremely brief exchange of gunfire initially, and the 2 squads still outdoors around the house, bolting around in their assaulting wedge formations. Maneuvers all being carried out to attack Joseph, as they heard the fire before it had even been called in on the radio from the squads inside, of course, thereby calling them to inform them that they had found Joseph. He didn't feel it from all the pulsating adrenaline moving through his system, but he'd actually been hit multiple times, mostly in his body armor, which had made the pinging sounds over where the steel plates sat within the Kevlar vest, covering his vital organs, but also one in his left arm near the shoulder, now bleeding profusely, which would really be felt to its fullest once he calmed down from the surge of powerful endorphins and natural painkillers now pulsating throughout his body. He bled profusely, but it was a clean in and out, blasting straight through his upper arm near the shoulder, ripping out flesh and muscle tissue along with it. He would badly need a suture kit or to cauterize it ASAP and disinfect the wound. Proper wound care in battle was definitely a very high priority, as blood loss, infections, or other related issues could lead to an early demise if left untreated. He was still being hotly pursued by 2 squads that broke off the platoon, leaving the other 2 remaining at the house to conduct a thorough clearing of it. Of the other pursuit squads, they kept in steady radio contact with the other 2, and with their headquarters platoon over their subordinate combat platoon within their specific company of truck infantry. They also deployed one of their quadcopter drones to map the area ahead in case of any potential additional threats so as to have accurate real-time intel to ensure there were no other enemy combatants planning to ambush them, using Joseph as some sort of bait. Being fired at the whole time, he continued running and began to disappear within the forested ridge back on the other side he'd originally came from before crossing where the homes sat in their specific area. The pelting, smacking rounds from rifles, light machine guns, and even the occasional barrel-launched 25mm grenade blasting here and there scared the hell out of Joseph as he ran like his life depended on it, because it damn sure did. After about 30 minutes of running and navigating the way he'd come as he had remembered it, the enemy fire gradually died out as they and even their drone had lost him by this point. No doubt they'd call in on their radio to other recon assets and give a report to them, who in turn would comb that specific area around the homes within a certain radius for any partisan activity. Another peril in the area were armed drones that could literally send an air-to-ground missile crashing into its targets. However, fortunately, he would escape such a threat to his life. Joseph got very blessed. Forget about luck. He was truly blessed by God and made it out, albeit very badly injured, but still alive. All as he ran along the forested ridge atop the southwestern side of the valley. He could see the road in the late afternoon, now becoming early evening as the sky turned to dusk. There now were Chi-Com vehicles, very likely of the unit from earlier that was on patrol, who returned to comb the area for partisan activity. Joseph, needless to say, mentally freaked out, not only when the agonizing pain of his left shoulder and upper arm area kicked in violently, but moreover, while he had seen also the trucks and MRAPs stopping on the road close by down in the valley, with the troops now all dismounting. The gunners were obviously on high alert, there to offer heavy fire support to the now dismounted truck infantry troops, with their powerful crew-serve weapons mounted aboard the vehicles. The infantry dismounts, now departing from the vehicles, began to check both sides of the valley floor, as the platoons each took a side of it, all carried out with their squads comprising these formations, moving from column to wedge formation, and then proceeding up the sides of the valley walls all the way to the ridge lines. Also in the area, though he didn't see it, was a high-flying armed drone, such having been called in as the nearest air asset available to comb the area alongside the ground troops as support. Joseph, of course, was already well aware of all these dangerous developments, even those unseen. He therefore tried to stay quiet and calm as best he could, so as to not draw any potentially unwanted awareness to himself within his current trajectory moving out of the area. Moreover, having himself spotted the Chi-Com activity on the ground, he kept up his pace as fast as he could while maintaining as much discretion as possible and trying to put pressure on the nasty, gaping arm wound in order to slow down the bleeding the best he could. Even including the assumption that he had that there would be air assets there as well, also looking for him vigorously. Joseph, therefore, managed to stay well hidden in all of his movements, staying quiet, silent, and tucked away in the trees of the forest. "Shit!" snapped Joseph, now in severe pain, while needing to move away and fast. He ended up desperately tearing some cloth from his shirt sleeve to use as a light tourniquet now that he was out of the hot zone. Not tight enough to completely cut off all the blood flow, as he was still on the move and couldn't risk potential complications for the time being. Therefore, he quickly tended to the massive chunk of flesh and muscle tissue completely blown out of his upper arm near the shoulder. His arm, though still barely usable, was severely weakened and would require therapy and light activity for it once taken care of, thereby done via primitive physical therapy techniques out in the forest. Being out in the woods, that would essentially consist of routines that would simulate much the same as was done back in civilized times in human settlements. This conducted with certain exercises and the like. Also, he was cut badly, so it appeared, from the leftover glass upon lurching out of the window, which of course wasn't anything near as bad as the gunshot wound, to be certain. But he was still a wreck, physically speaking, all the way around. And if he didn't hurry, he quite possibly could die out in the forest and not even make it back with the others. He began running again, already having a bit of a decent head start. He hoped he could get far enough away that the Chi-Coms would lose interest in a pursuit. He earlier fired back at them in the house as soon as they busted into the house's doors, but he couldn't even remember if he had even hit any of them. It was all so fast, like a literal blur within his memory banks. He may have actually hit one of them while they were close by, doing so upon their busting through the doors of the home, but they sure as hell hit him, and many times in his sappy plate-covered armored spots. These in front and back, along with his nasty gaping arm wound too. If he did hit one of them and wound or maybe even eliminate one, that may have provoked them into pursuit, such a vigorous pursuit of one single man so aggressively. However, there was no way he could even remember. The experience was truly traumatic for him, like a suspenseful horror film, due to such close proximity and sudden bursts, along with how they entered so rapidly. He hated now being on the other side of such style of raids. It truly had deeply freaked him out insofar as directly being on the receiving end of a stack team raid. This particular situation now serving to remind him that nowhere was safe from the enemy and their patrols, as they were already constantly scouring even the mountains and countryside looking for partisan activity. This early into the literal beginnings of their occupation phase. An occupation starting now that the invasion phase itself was essentially, for all intents and purposes, over and done with. Now he moved ever faster, egressing and escaping the area, and the attempted miniature dragnet now out to get him were it possible. He wished he had gone to SEER training while in the Marine Corps, because now he was literally doing the same thing, albeit in real life instead of a well-crafted simulated scenario on an island. As time wore on, and he began to move safely beyond the valley and higher up into the area of the foothills just below the specific mountain his people were on, he finally started to slow down his pace and therefore let himself catch his breath from all that he'd just endured. Fortunately for him, he had his NVG monocle optic, which would help carry him home now that it was dark out. He wondered, as his run became a jog, as he tired out from traversing such rough terrain much of the way, if his little luxury bag of such items and also curiosity for inspecting the homes was even worth it all. As nasty and bad as the earlier battle was, and he nearly even died then, and also during other times earlier, that the raid breaking in on him all alone had been the most terrifying jolt he'd thus far received throughout this entire conflict. He kept on moving for about 4 more hours before finally making it up the mountain, arriving with the others still hiding out in the cave systems safely for now in high altitude. He encountered a posted guard of the Partisans, himself hiding on the outskirts of their then current positions, who noticed it was their other leader, Joseph. Therefore was Joseph allowed past, after the guard noticed his injury and ran with Joseph to tell others with medical experience to hurry up and tend to him. There were some former civilian healthcare workers amongst the group who could, with primitive means, manage to treat wounds and battlefield trauma. Joseph was about to be in even more severe agony from cauterization of the wound due to his medical emergency, as well as from previous blood loss sustained by that point. There were no more suture kits on hand, as many specialty medical supplies had since been utilized to treat the many wounded from the previous several days of combat as a whole, and whatever remained, especially now after the morning mountain battle, was very sparse in terms of amounts available. Therefore, would drastic measures need to be taken in order not only to supply conservation not only for supply conservation reasoning, to preserve what minuscule supplies remained, but because it was a dire emergency in the case of his gunshot wound, due to how many hours it had been untreated. Cauterization was severely painful, but it was the only way. Some of the muscle tissue could make a comeback over time, but Joseph would badly need to take it easy on his left arm in the meantime, likely for a few months. Joseph himself, so long as he ate a proper diet and conducted therapeutic level exercises to aid in his recovery, had a chance. He needed it all to cease, and now, insofar as all the pain and bleeding. Such procedure was then carried out, along with ointments and bandages after searing it. These then placed on top in order to prevent even so much as any potential for infections. It was also inferred and fairly apparent to the medical staff within the group that his upper arm bone was badly fractured from the transfer of the energy of the hydrostatic shock, this directly having an effect on the bone so close to the tissue injury he had sustained. Of course, this itself would need perhaps to be carefully all monitored as well as being splinted for any remotely possible infection or for any worsening from the bone-related injuries. He then, beyond his emergency wound treatment, went to see Sally, who comforted him, although also asking scoldingly where he'd been and even what the hell happened to him. The group was in possession of some antibiotics and painkillers, as well as a tiny remaining quantity of pharmaceutical varieties. These items were handled by one of the town's of Butte's former doctors within the group. Also, there were some more natural herbal remedies like kratom being still in supply, therefore in decent quantities, and also even the more common Lactuca virosa, also called wild lettuce, which could be created to be a potent painkiller. In addition, Joseph was also given by the doctors in the group an epoetin injection, such given to help him recover red blood cells as he had lost so much in earlier combat from his arm wound. These now diminishing medical items would end up being a major blessing to aid Joseph during his agonizing recovery while out in the wilds of nature, as the wilderness was now the only area whereabouts that the Partisans could live even remotely free. Furthermore, despite the freedom from slavery that came from living away from human settlements at this time, Joseph discovered firsthand, albeit with dire consequences, that it just not worth it, especially when traveling alone. Were he with others, near a larger grouping of enemies even, they'd likely have either called in air or artillery strikes on them, but he was indeed fortunate that it had been only him, so the response wasn't as savage as they had pursued him. Well, he was at least feeling like that in some ways. It was hard times currently, and of course, any human being, when desperate, could and likely would take exactly the same sorts of chances that Joseph had undertaken. After all, luxury items would be immensely difficult to come by, and as time progressed further, such would eventually dry up entirely and gradually disappear. Currently, just 4 days into the invasion and beginning subsequent occupation, it was already rough in the sense of valuables and commodities. Therefore, Joseph's strong human desires, beneath such circumstances, overloaded and had overridden his better judgments when it pertained to the overall situation as it related to going after luxury items at the time. His mind was wired for military mindedness from his time in the Marine Corps, but he took some risks anyway, and now he paid for it horribly, and that much was definitely apparent. All wasn't lost insofar as his little mission earlier undertaken was concerned. After all, his aim was to scout in order to conduct vital reconnaissance for the overall group as a whole. And what he discovered firsthand was of critical importance. He figured out that the roads and homes were crawling with Chi-Com patrols, which signified severe danger in that particular direction, insofar as it related to the areas he had personally checked out. It wasn't a coincidence that vehicles had passed by before he had even discovered the road, whereupon which sat the homes, where they dropped troops off. He wouldn't have likely even seen anything if the roads weren't important enough and not being frequently in use by the enemy. Also, the fact that the long-range foot patrols were seemingly regularly checking the remains of human settlements in the area was itself a sign that the southeast, away from the mountain in the higher mountain valley running north to south roughly, was now essentially off limits to the Partisans. No nomadic escapades were to be made there. However, that valley road would be an ideal location for a future ambush, perhaps, on smaller enemy elements or upon logistical convoys, were there some sort of concrete schedule of such transports to ever become even available for the Partisans in order to use to intercept such. For now, though, he now could confidently, during planning sessions in the near future with the major and subordinate leaders, completely rule out moving to that area. As far as it pertained to the whole group, that would be too much of a high-risk endeavor. Moreover, it wouldn't be impossible to bypass the area, but lingering there for too long wasn't an option, to be sure. Therefore, other areas would be sought for moving to by the next day. Knowing what he now knew, he wouldn't be totally in the proverbial dark, so to speak, when it came to knowing what lay off beyond the mountain itself. Other options would be to head north, down into the foothills below the mountain from where they now currently sat as an element currently in hiding. Thus far, this option seemed the most viable, as the PAP were in Bozman, and Butte was a fortress of the forces they'd fought earlier in the morning of the Chi-Com National Militia on the other side of the mountain. Beyond that, the southeast was too perilous after what Joseph had just endured and found out. Hence, northward it was, and north it would be. Joseph, upon receiving treatment, and before turning in for the night, went off to consult the major over his personal ideas and plans, as well as to disclose all that had occurred directly to him during their making of their immediate term plans. Indeed, would there be many plans now in the works, as one phase of war now officially wound down with a formal transition into occupation and counterinsurgency, and new war of independence thus waged by the Partisans that came along with it. Occupier, and also occupied, would now be locked into a long-lasting, epic struggle for life and death on the part of the occupied and the subjugated. Also, for national prestige and gains consolidation on the part of the occupying powers. The worst part of all of it was that the many brutally savage, destructive years now lay ahead for those beneath the yoke of the Red Dragon, as it was really all only just getting started in earnest. Within all the localities of the region, the smaller cities and towns had been painted red with G and CCP propaganda, along with the red banners of the party, and also Nation of China and its flag. Even huge oil paintings of Xi himself, along with portable giant plasma screens playing non-stop Chinese propaganda movies within public venues, which once had been American plazas, squares, parks, and public buildings. China ruled and made this fact clearly evident within all areas beneath its brutal, fanatical, tyrannical police state secular humanist regime, wherein Xi and the party were God with a little g. End part 30.